Greetings everyone, welcome. I'm Josh Rappaport from Boston College. I'm the host of this session and a member of the program committee for the conference. Welcome to the concurrent plenary session, NIH S10 Proposals, Tips for a Successful Application, which will be chaired by Caroline Chamoux and sponsored by Promega. Throughout the session, please put questions into the Zoom chat and they'll be posed to the panel later in the session. You can enter them at any time. We'd like to acknowledge and thank Promega for sponsoring this plenary session. They are introducing a new series of proline and alanine specific proteases for proteomics. Unfortunately, they won't be able to have a presentation in this session, but we encourage you to visit their booth to learn more about their technologies. Now, let's start the session and I'll hand it over to Caroline.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh. So welcome everyone. It's great to see that so many people are here. As Josh and I were helping to plan the meeting program, we had the idea to schedule a prominent session dedicated to the important topic of writing successful NIH S10 shared instrumentation grant applications. S10 applications are complex. They require components that are different than in most other NIH mechanisms, and they require justifications that are most effective if they're framed in very specific ways. So good grantsmanship is key to the success of an S10 application. So we thought it would be helpful if we could provide concrete guidance in our session today. The members of our panel, next slide please, Simon. The members of our panel all have firsthand experience writing successful S10 grants and/or participating as reviewers in S10 study sections. My fellow panel members are Simon Watkins from the University of Pittsburgh. He's professor in the Department of Cell Biology. Sherry Thornton from the, she's director of the Research Flow Cytometry Core at Cincinnati Children's Medical Center Hospital. And then my host, our fellow host, Josh Rappaport from Boston College, who's executive director for research infrastructure. I'm associate dean for research technology and cores at Harvard Medical School. We'd also like to thank Alina Horska from the NIH Office of Research Infrastructure Programs that helps oversee the S10 program. She answered many of our questions as we developed this presentation, and it's been really wonderful to have her input. Okay, so for today, after a few introductory slides that I'll present, Simon will take over for the presentation. This presentation is based actually on other presentations that Simon has given to other audiences about S10 grant writing. So during the talk, please post questions in the chat, and then I'll return afterwards to moderate the panel Q&A portion of the session. Okay, so to get started, we thought it would be helpful to provide an overview of the S10 Instrumentation Grant Program. It's administered by the Office of Research Infrastructure Programs, and there's only one submission date each year. And generally it's in late May or early June. This year and last year, it's June 1st. There are 3 funding level opportunities. A new program this year is the Basic Instrumentation Grant Program. It's limited to institutions that have not received S10 instrumentation funding above $250,000 in any of the federal fiscal years 2018 to 2020. You have to check with your institution if you are qualified to apply to this program. It's not something that many individual investigators can ascertain for themselves. The most commonly used S10 mechanism is the Shared Instrumentation Grant Program, or SIG, that supports research instrumentation requests in the $50,000 to $600,000 range. And finally, the High-End Instrumentation Grant Program supports instrumentation above $600,000 to $2 million. And we've provided a link here to the NIH S10 Instrumentation Program website. And you'll be able to access a copy of these slides after the meeting. Okay, next slide, please. When applying for a grant, it's always good to understand the review process. So Simon is going to discuss review panels a bit as well, but we wanted to note in this slide here that their S10 study sections fall into 6 broad categories of expertise. Biological chemistry and macromolecular physics. Those panels review requests for mass specs and NMR instruments. bioengineering sciences and technologies that review computing requests. Cell biology, there are many panels here that focus on optical microscopes and tweezers, electron microscopes, both standard and cryo-EM, and cell sorters. The genes, genomes, and genetics panel reviews sequencer requests. There's a sort of a catch-all panel, interdisciplinary molecular sciences and training, that does many different types of sort of analysis and assay readout instruments, the seahorse instruments, laboratory automation and high throughput screening platforms, surface plasmon resonance, and other instruments. And then finally, the surgical sciences, biomedical imaging, and bioengineering panel reviews requests for PET, CT scanners, whole animal fluorescence, irradiators, and things like that. The number of study sections in each category varies annually, depending on the number of applications. And also some panels are quite large. Optical microscopy is one, but others are quite small, such as electron microscopy. So, right. Oh, I also wanted to highlight that about the funding rate is actually fairly high at about 32%, considering many NIH programs. And in FY 2019, 407 applications were reviewed and 130 grants were funded. So that's a funding rate of about 32%. Okay, so now with this introduction, I'll hand the slides over to Simon for the rest of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending and listening to this, I think, very important mechanism, which I've used greatly. And as was said earlier, the panel have had a lot of experience with this mechanism. So please don't feel shy about asking complicated or difficult questions. We also have our colleagues from the NIH at the session. So if we get really stuck, I'm sure they can be asked to help us out with issues that we have problems with. So this header is probably the most significant in that these are shared instrumentation grants. And what I want to do is talk about the kinds of things that are eligible and how the mechanism works, what you need to get together to submit one of these grants. And I think probably the most important thing is to understand things you can really mess up when you put the grant together, which need to be avoided as much as possible. So the first thing is these are shared instruments, and the majority of the users should be NIH-funded investigators. The PI of the grant, as we'll talk about later, does not necessarily have to hold an independent R01 or mechanism like that, but the users have to be NIH funded. You need a minimum of 3. 3 is a fairly easy goal to hit. The upper limit's a bit more confusing. There's a tendency to put like tons of people in, but then if you do that, you don't really get a chance to describe how they're going to use the instrumentation that you're requesting. At the moment, there's a page limit. I think it's 24 pages for the scientific section of the grant where you describe the projects. So you need to think rationally about how many investigators should be in the grant to reach the number you need. Generally, in my grants, I try to get about 8 to 10 good, strong research projects involved. The one important thing to recognize is, though, this mechanism is really directed at shared facilities. Many of you direct shared facilities, you live in shared facilities, and you are the ideal candidates for this mechanism. It's not a way for a senior investigator to get a bunch of buddies together because he wants some gadget but doesn't want to pay for it and ask the federal government to pay for it. Another thing that's, and to be quite honest, as you'll see later, the panel will always see through this kind of application. They're very experienced, both because as you'll see also, many of them belong as shared facility managers or have been sitting on these panels for a very long time. Another thing that's really important to recognize is the science that's being used, the instrument that will be used for, is not being evaluated in the mechanism. These are instrumentations that will advance the science that's ongoing. They will make the science quicker, bigger, better, more complete, but they've already been funded. So you're not there, you don't have to prove the scientific merit of what you're doing. You have to prove why the device you're requesting will make that science so much better than it is without that device. Importantly, though, you really need to know what you're talking about. And that's probably the larger part of what I want to imbue with you today, imbue on you today. You need to know why you need the device, how it's going to improve the science, and what it's going to do for the group as a whole. So there's several important components to the mechanism. And the first one, and the most fundamental, is, do you need the device that you're requesting? It's absolutely essential that you write a grant for something that you need. Also, do you have, as a team, enough sufficient technical expertise to drive the device? That means not only to drive the machine, but prepare the samples and deal with the data that comes out of the machine after you've used it. Have you chosen the right device? And also, will the instrument solve the problems being studied? Essentially, these speak to your expertise level when you submit the grant. One area that's often under, and these are all things we'll go into in more depth in a few minutes, but another thing that's often underrepresented in the proposal is the organizational and management plan good? Is it practical? For those of you running shared facilities, obviously you live in this world of good organizational plans and good management plans, because that's a large part of your life. And if you are putting together a grant which includes several folks who are not working in that facility, they need to really appreciate how important your input is on the organizational management plan. Nowadays, because a lot of the things are being requested, produce buckets of data, we also need to have an understanding of what's going to happen to the material when it comes out, how's it going to be distributed, so on and so forth. And also, do you know how to train on it? These are really important issues that have to be described at great length. And the last part is the cost recovery viable and compliant with the NIH guidelines? And this is something we'll touch on again later, but it's really a critical thing that the institutional support is there and states very clearly that they will continue to support that instrument for at least 5 years after it's awarded. If the money that you've said that will be available through user fees or whatever fails to meet that fiscal limit, has to be there. There's no point in providing an instrument to a group if that group cannot afford to pay the usage costs. So there's, for example, high-end instruments like a cryo-EM, they're phenomenally expensive, but they're also phenomenally expensive to run. And so there needs to be a very clear description of how you're going to pay for the use of the machine and recover the costs of using the machine for the duration of the life of the machine. Okay. The panel, and this is something that when you're writing a proposal, you should really think about. The panel is not like a normal NIH panel. The panel is pulled from people who've been awarded these grants and also people who know a lot about the subject matter. Maybe not the depth of the individual science, but they'll know a lot about how the particular device that people are requesting works and is used. Often the panels pulled from people who've recently been awarded grants and also, as I said, cognoscenti, people who are the wise people in the field. They can be from all ranks, senior faculty, center managers, instrument builders, and instrument users. If any of you do get the opportunity to sit on one of these panels, I thoroughly encourage you to do it and ask whoever you report to let you do it, because the best way of learning what is a good and poor application is to sit on one of these panels. They're incredible learning experiences. But the fact is that what this means is the panel really know their stuff, and you need to make sure that what you write that you know what you're talking about, because if you don't, and you're just, as we'll talk about again later, if you don't know what you're talking about, you should not be applying for this grant. Okay, so what's the primary thing you need to worry about? The first thing to think of is need. Is the absolute most critical thing. There's a huge difference between want and need. So I want lots of things. Well, I actually, I'm pretty lucky, but if you really, you may want lots of things. It's kind of like a kid. They want something, but they don't need it. And a lot of people you might work with want something, but if you don't need it and you can't justify the request by clearly stating how it will improve the science, then you're going to have a tough time getting the award through. So if you need something and you really need it, the grant should almost write itself. And importantly, this mechanism is not only about cutting edge stuff. It's not only about the latest and greatest sequencer or flow system or microscope. It's about making sure that the infrastructure you have in your institution is sufficient to answer the problems being requested by funded individuals. For example, if you've got, loads and loads of confocals in your institution, I'm a microscopist, so I probably will use microscopy analogies all the time. If you ask, you've got loads and loads of microscopes, but you can't get time on any of them, then that's a reason to need more microscope time to get your NIH funded research done, right? It's not necessary to be the most cutting edge thing, but there needs to be absolute need. So here's an example. This is a grant I submitted a couple of years ago, actually, 5 years ago. And in the grant, I showed need by putting in timetables. This was a usage table of a machine that's used close to 3,000 hours a year. Every day is full, sometimes not the weekend, the weekends less so, but you can see very clearly this is a very, very heavily used instrument. And I pulled the table and I stated in the grant that this was pulled on February 1 and this was the usage for the rest of the month. Lots of people doing lots of good things, but no room for anyone else. So massively overused. As I said, this one particular device was used 3,000 hours a year. It's just another way of demonstrating need. Here's one from a high-end application I wrote in, was awarded in 2018. I applied in 2017. This was for a multiphoton system. The way we reserve multiphotons in my facility is to book entire days, because those of you who do multiphoton will know that to run through several animals, if you're doing intravital, it does take all day. So you can see this machine is completely full. But more importantly, you can use other things to show need. For example, in this particular instance, I used an email I got from one of my colleagues that says very specifically, my postdocs have no home life because they have to come in at weekends and use this microscope, which is so absurdly overused. Again, it's about showing need. And there's all sorts of ways you can do it. Just think about the way you would like to be shown need if you were asking for something from your institution or from the mechanism. It's just demonstrating that there is an absolute requirement for this device. Other things you can show are, the device you have is no longer current. Now, it's really important to recognize that what's no longer current really isn't no longer current. And again, we'll touch on that in a minute. But in this particular instance where I showed that the microscope was fully used, in actual fact, this didn't actually pass. All the reviewers weren't believing that this instrument was being used 2,500 hours a year. And some of the reviewers, and here's the comment from the critique, even though I said it's being used 2,500, it's not fully utilized, which I found a little ironic because 2,500 is a normal 2,008 hours in a working week. I personally think that this is at saturation, but it got funded. But you need to recognize that not everyone will agree with you and not everyone will feel the same way you do about saturation. Luckily, the other reviewers didn't agree with this particular individual in the critique. So can I use this mechanism to replace old devices? And there's an absolute definite yes in this, but what is old? And the truth is, if you think it's old, how do you justify getting a new one? Okay, the best route and the clearest route is most of these devices are under service contract, and generally part of the mechanism, to satisfy the mechanism, you do need to define that the system will be maintained under service contract for the long period. So the best way to do this is to get a letter from the manufacturer, not the sales rep, from the absolute top of the line person you can find, saying categorically that the device you have will no longer be supported and it's reached the end of its natural life and parts are not available, etc., etc., etc. But that's the way to show, because if they will not maintain service on that instrument and it goes down, then it's terminally broken. And so this way, by showing people with a letter, it really gets you I've shown you I can't maintain this microscope. But truth is that the folks in this panel know what's old. And they really know their stuff. So the fact you think it's old and it can still be maintained doesn't mean it's old. And there's another problem here. If you say, I need to replace this with a newer device because it's no longer working or working poorly, in truth, this may reflect your inability to maintain that microscope, or the fact that you haven't maintained that centrifuge or whatever device it is. You may not have done a good job of maintaining it, and you just want another one because you broke it, and that's really a problem. Okay, the next part, and this really speaks to the last comment I made. The panel's knowledgeable, so there is a clear and definite point where knowledge is important. And as part of the mechanism, there's a place where you compare devices and say why you specifically want a particular instrument. You essentially pull out the features that improve your science such that you can do things you couldn't do before, that makes the NIH funded research much more compelling and powerful. And so we all have different opinions about what's better, and that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, some people, if you're looking at cars, some people like electric cars over hybrids, over pure gas cars. There's reasons why we have opinion. However, by writing down in the grant specifically why you prefer this instrument over that instrument allows you to show your knowledge base. One of the most sort of infuriating things is when you see, well, it's not infuriating because it really actually has a very negative effect on the proposal, is when an individual starts reciting verbiage from brochures. And I've seen this lots and lots of times when I'm reviewing grants. And for example, I saw word for word this particular sentence here about, and these are great detectors and it's a great microscope, but they use these words exactly. And it really, to me, spoke that the person who was making this grant or putting this grant together really was just relying on written stuff in the literature, not from their personal experience or not from their knowledge base. So it's a real problem when you do that. There are also comments which you really shouldn't have in, and those of you in microscopists in this room might enjoy these. The rest of you can just shrug your shoulders and tell us where. But for example, I've seen we nearly need multiphoton because it's improved resolution over a single photon. STED is very easy to implement with most available fluorophores on mountains. These are not correct, and honestly, they really speak to lack of knowledge and the use of hearsay. So make sure that you know what you're talking about when you put these statements in, and make sure that someone who, if you don't know, make sure the person who reads the grant with you knows what they're talking about, because these can be damning. Okay, preliminary data. This is a really important issue to think about. And in fact, when we were putting this panel together, Josh, Sherry, and Caroline and I discussed this at great length because we have different experiences on these study sections. And the truth is, and this is written in the S10 program, frequently asked questions, if you can demonstrate an instrument, if you can show preliminary data, it's a really good way of showing that this is why you need the device, and this is why it makes your science better. The science has already been judged, as I said, but by showing preliminary data, you can show that you need the thing to improve what you can do already. Secondly, it shows that you can use or ask questions with it expertly. There may have been someone else in the room helping you do it, but it gives the idea that you know what you're doing as an expert. And also, obviously, it clearly demonstrates that you can use the machine to solve the problem. There is an important facet here, that if you do show preliminary data, that preliminary data needs to be convincing. Don't use a lousy confocal image and show how a STED system makes it look better, because that just shows that you don't know how you're using a confocal, because you couldn't take a good image with the confocal. But if you could use the device to do clever things, and I'll show you an example in the next slide, you should include it. And preliminary data, in my mind, particularly if you're using cutting edge approaches which are not commonly used, differentiate between the want and need component. So if you want a device and you can show that you need the device, it's very different to just wanting a device. I'm sure you can get the difference here. But as I said a few seconds ago, only show preliminary data that makes a solid, clear point. Don't put preliminary data in just for the sake of it. Just put the show preliminary data that really makes a solid point. So this is from a 3x STED system, which was successful a few years ago from my group. And we included 8 projects, and we actually had 11 projects that wanted to be part of the project, but I honestly wasn't convinced myself as a person who's critical that 3 of the projects met the barrier for really needing the device. One of the major areas we're working on was on mitochondrial structure. And this shows mitochondria in an axial view when we're looking at the mitochondria in a confocal image. And this is showing it with the STED, where you can clearly see the luminal area of the mitochondria and start localizing molecules inside that area. And this actually has been one of our most powerful uses of this device since we were awarded it, where we can define where individual molecules are, or individual families of molecules are within the entire matrix of a mitochondria. So show preliminary data if you can, show how it advances the science, but don't use preliminary data just for the sake of it. Use it to make an absolute point of expertise and need. So how do you do the research part? There's all this in the grant. There's a whole bunch of instrument comparisons, there's the management plan, and so on and so forth. But the research project is the meat and potatoes of what you're going to do with it. You need to describe very clearly how the device will benefit and enhance individual users' NIH-funded research. Generally, I reckon you need about 2 pages, between 1 and 2 pages per project to show this. And each project should define the instrument. They should define what they're going to use with it and how it's going to help their aims. You don't want to just get the abstract from a person's grant and say at the end 2 sentences, and we want this because it will improve the resolution. You need to tell them why, what you're going to show, how it's going to work, and if you can, as I said, show it with preliminary data. It needs to be dealt with very specifically and individually, and to make a compelling case. Personally, if I get descriptions from individuals when I'm putting one of these grants together, I edit them all. I edit them all so the words are spoken from the viewpoint of a person that knows what they're talking about, but also that there's a common style. also a common font, a common sense that this was an integrated proposal put together by an integrated group who were going to place it in a shared facility, and it would maximally benefit the largest group of individuals. There are tables that you must include, and essentially your user groups are divided into heavy users or major users and minor users. For each user, you need the details of the grant that's working on that be used to support the work, how many hours they're going to use a year, and we're going to get to this in a bit, but the estimated percentage of the accessible user time use. One important facet here is accessories are obviously grant dependent. Let's say you're asking for, again, we'll use microscope, a confocal. You may need different accessories which can change the price base for that device. Now, don't forget the panel will see, let's say, 10 grants for the same microscope or centrifuge or flow cytometer, and then there's one that's much more expensive, and it's because they've got lots of accessories. That's okay, but you must justify the accessories inside the context of the grant so people know how you need them, why you need them, and what they're there for. You can't just plug them in, because the reviewers will see 10 grants that are all looking the same in terms of budget, except this one that has all these extra bits and pieces added in. It needs to be justified. The management plan is really critical, and I think the audience, you as an audience, will be the most experienced people to write this. Do not shortchange this. It's really the area where it shows that the device is being used in a shared facility. There's a professional level of management, of organization, of integration, and et cetera, which is only evident in a truly shared facility. People will put these things together and sort of write a page on, we're going to manage this. That's not a shared instrument, and it's not going into shared facilities. So you really don't want to shortchange this device. You need to have a clear maintenance plan. You need to have a description of how you prioritize access. You need to describe who's going to run the machine. You've got to really have expertise and show that the people running the device know what they're doing. You really don't want to have postdocs or junior people running these things unless that's all they're going to do, because they should really be focusing on their own science. You need to make sure you have a training plan. You need to make sure there's a financial plan for cost recovery, and you do actually have to include a table that it's going to cost me this amount of dollars per year to run this, and this amount is the cost for the service contract. This amount is for salaries for the person who's going to maintain it, and so on and so forth. You also need to establish an oversight committee, and this is true, and many of you already have oversight committees, so it's not a big deal to do it. But if you're a shared facility already, this is a relatively easy thing to do. But if you're writing this as a group of investigators, you need to establish a core environment. You need to make sure that whatever you're going to buy is used and developed within that core environment. Institutional support, I think, needs to be not vague. You do not have to have part in an NIH supported mechanism. There doesn't have to be funds to pay for part of the microscope and for centrifuge or whatever device, or mass spec system, unless you are exceeding the cap. So if you put in a grant for 600K and the machine actually costs 800K, you need to say where the other 200,000 are coming from. But the details of the financial report that you mention in your proposal should be very clearly described in the institutional letter, and describe what support is committed to the instrument, and so on and so forth. This is not something you can get a soft letter from. They need to categorically, the institution, and not you, I mean, you can't write your own letter. And normally it comes from a very senior official in the institution. They need to write very categorically this: I will ensure that, this is one from one of my grants, that in the case of shortfall of funds to maintain it, I will make sure that all service costs, etc., are paid. It has to be there. It really is important. Okay, so other things you need to think about. And I showed this earlier in my timetable. Does the instrument eliminate, where I showed a timetable, a calendar of the use of one of our instruments, does the instrument eliminate bottlenecks? Does it improve workflow? Can you show this how? And I showed that with calendars. How do the features improve workflow? Do you show that the device is characteristics? Really, really advance the science. Again, if you really need this device, these things will be self-evident. You never want to ask for more than you need. If you start putting in all these extras because you think one day you'll want it, then it's not going to work. You need to actually ask for what is needed by the team, and don't inflate, because it will be not looked on very favorably. Really, if you can, you don't want to design the system by committee. In other words, get a very small cohort, or just do it yourself, and define what you need to improve the life of your scientists, colleagues, and ask for that. Don't use a committee, because you'll end up with a machine that actually may not even work properly, and have all these extra things on because person A wanted this and person B wanted that, and you end up with a really impractical solution. You don't want to put lots of instruments in one request. There used to be a mechanism where you could do this, animal facilities and things, but that's been removed from this. It's really only one device. As I said before, you've got to make sure that the quote comes from the manufacturer is realistic and not inflated. Remember that commonly lots and lots of requests for the same device were present in any one study section. Oh, and you cannot, absolutely cannot request service contracts or salaries or anything in the mechanism. You're only requesting funds to pay for the device. That's it, nothing else. Okay, there commonly is a question about who should be the principal investigator or program director. And it's really, for this mechanism, it's probably one of the few mechanisms where the PI doesn't have to be a faculty with an NIH funded program. And in many ways, the best person to run the device and ask for this device is the person who knows most, which is a facility manager. There's no reason why a person who's a core director who has sufficient expertise can play the leadership role. Generally, if you are a core manager, you may want to touch on and get assistance from someone who's really experienced in writing these kinds of grants. Commonly, your institution has a grants management and a place that helps you write grants. Make sure they know what they're doing when they're writing an S10 grant, but there is lots and lots of help out there if you want, but make sure you get that, because it's really, there are certain nuances in the NIH funding grant assembly process that you need to pay attention to. Another question that comes up a lot is what's accessible user time, or AUT? How do you calculate it? It's really the number of hours per year that the device can be used. And there's lots of things that can limit this. Theoretically, 2,000 hours is a full-time work week. Other devices can be used way more than this. Others can only be used a lot less. And it really depends on how much time you need to put for maintenance. I mean, how open the building is, how much skilled expertise you need. All these things are realistic and pragmatic limits on how many hours you can use, but you need to be pragmatic. You need to define this and explain why this machine has this number of usable hours. And also remember that you need to break down the predicted use by the individuals against this number of user hours. Clearly defined in a table. It's in the instructions that you have to do it. I think finally, or nearly finally, you need to organize your application neatly. And as I said before, have the same font throughout, have the same tongue, the same language. Make sure that you read the PAR. This is the program announcement, because the program announcements tend to change from year to year. There are certain things that become more rigorous and some things become less rigorous in this mechanism. And you really need to read it from end to end every time you're going to submit one of these grants, because they do change. For example, I wrote one a few years back and I finished it and I was putting it together, and then I noticed, and I had like 50 pages worth of science, and then I found that I was only allowed 24 pages. So I had to go back in 24 hours and completely rewrite the entire project section. Read the application PAR so you know what you're applying, how to do the best application. So finally, there's only one submission date per year. Unlike a regular competitive grant, there is only one submission date a year. And the process is slow. It's complicated, it's slow. And so you really want to make sure that you do your absolute best every time you submit these grants. Also, and finally, the people don't write as if you know more than the people on the panel. Write as if they're your colleagues and they know the same as you or more than you, because honestly, they know exactly what you want. They live in the same world as you. They've all written successful grants, and they tend to be a little cynical if you try and hoodwink them, or you try to get around the basic conditions and concerns and concepts that are in the mechanism. But with that, I think I'll stop my presentation and we can talk a little bit about some questions that we came up with, and then hand over to questions that come from viewers. And there's been lots of them flying by me as I've been talking. I'm going to hand the gavel back to Caroline, and we will go from there. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Simon. That was great. Yeah. So this is that's an excellent presentation. Yeah, I'll start to field actually some of the questions from the audience. I think, and frankly, some of them overlap a little bit with our questions. So I'll mix in the questions from the audience with our questions. Right. So we'll just start with this one here. What role should a core director or manager play in writing an application? And Sherry, I don't know if you'd like to address this.
Sure. Yes. So as a core director myself, and I am faculty, but yes, you can go ahead and write the S10. You have to have an ERS or a commons name for that. But the other thing is, the first grant that we ever wrote, which I would say I wrote not as the PI, but as someone who was writing the grant to help a faculty member. I think it's really important that the director and the manager have their input, because as Simon said, you know the instrument and you know the way it's going to work for people. But then after that, I've written 2 other ones that were successful. So getting that experience first is really important.
Great, thank you.
So if I could just add something. Yeah, so there is a term called technical personnel referred to in the program announcement. So you can have, Simon did talk about who could be the PI, PD, and the core, technical personnel. You can include bio sketches for technical personnel. So it can be a mix of administrative roles, managerial roles, technical roles, and, obviously scientific roles listed on the grant.
Right. Okay, so another question is it important that the requested instrument, is it important that the requested instrument be the only one of its kind that's available to users? Simon, do you want to ask that or answer that?
I spoke to this at length in the presentation. I think, no, obviously, if you can justify it through need, then that's totally reasonable. As there are interesting situations where you have a community in which an instrument may exist, say across town. And if you really need that device, you need to explain why across town doesn't work. So, live cells don't travel well, animals have to be moved from animal facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can justify the reason why you need another one, even though there is one across town, and make it very clear, that's okay. But there are certain situations where there is none available and it will be the only one of its kind. If you do that, you need to make sure that you've got clear evidence, presumably through preliminary data, that shows need and why this particular device is essential to the ongoing research programs that are already funded by the NIH.
Yeah. Okay, now I'll take a couple of questions, I think, from the...
Can I just follow up on what Simon said again, just real quick, and say that, you know, he already mentioned, you know, letters. So, for example, the letter from the supplier saying that it won't be covered under service contract, if that's part of your justification and rationale. Similarly, letters from the people responsible for those instruments that might be in existence but not accessible or not have capacity or whatever. So anything you can document, anything you can back up explicitly with, you know, real numbers, real documentation, letters that are signed by people is always going to be helpful.
I actually want to echo what Josh said. When I submitted one of the grants I've submitted for that multi-photon, there are many labs with individual multi-photons around campus, and I got letters from every one of them saying you can't use mine, very specifically stating they're either fully used with their experimental programs or they weren't suitable because they were full of electrophysiology apparatus, etc. So make sure you exclude devices that are already at your institution by getting letters. You can never have too many letters.
Right. Okay. So those answers relate to some of the questions in the chat. So I'll address a few of those. So one person asked, what about instruments that are very old, but that are still performed by the manufacturer? And I can take this one because I've definitely seen applications for those that have been successful. You just need a letter from the manufacturer that says that it is no longer supportable, right? The model may still be produced, but your particular instrument is, it can't be supported any longer. If it can still be supported by the manufacturer, but you need new features, then you have to justify why you need to buy a new instrument with those new features to support the science and the projects that are proposed. Okay. Another question asks about the whether integrated instrumentation can be considered, right, or just a single instrument. And again, in my study section, I've definitely seen successful applications for that. Where there are components that are, you know, they're required to work together separately. They're not an instrument. And again, the justification just has to be very clear as to why the individual components make sort of one entity. And I highly recommend that you talk to the program to get some particular wording and even sort of have them answer any questions you might have about suitability of applying for a particular instrument system.
Can I speak on that for a second?
Yes,
Karen?
of course.
I think one of the issues to remember is service and support for those instruments. So you need to make sure that if you have an integrated program or an instrument that comes from multiple vendors, that you have a common source of support for those devices, so you can make sure that they all have the minimum of 5 years of support for that's needed to be successful or to meet the requirements of the mechanism. And commonly that might be a little difficult when you're putting together a home-built device or something that's not standard, first of kind or something like that. Okay. But as Karen says, talk to the folks at program. They'll let you know what you can do.
Yeah. Then there's another quick question that I can answer. If the vendor quote includes an extended warranty, is this acceptable? And the answer is no. You have to remove the amount of the extended warranty from your request. You can only request for the instrument itself. The extended warranty can appear in the quote, and you can refer to it, you know, in your budget, right, when you're describing the cost of the service contract, but you cannot request the amount for the extended warranty in your request to the NIH. Okay, so Sherry, I have a question for you about the impact of COVID on grant prep this year. I'm wondering whether in your institution, whether you've discussed this at all. It's a very different year with it being very difficult to do demos and possibly even with financial implications for support for future years.
Right, we have not done demos. We've had new instruments incorporated. We've actually, in saying that we haven't done demos, we actually have had other sites help us with those kind of things. So it was key for just an internal institutional instrument that we had somebody help us sort on a sorter in Boston. So we had those connections. So if any connections, if you have networking anywhere, We've talked to many people around about the sorter that we're actually going to purchase. And I think that can help you. The other thing that I would recommend, which has worked well, is also talk to people who have these things already in cores, and they have their, they have their protocols in place. They're working well. They could write you a letter for that, and also share their, just their service and what has happened with that, because that will help you write the grant as well.
Great. Josh or Simon, did you want to comment about plans for S10s in this difficult year?
I don't think there's, what do you mean, that the mechanism has been made public by the NIH?
Maybe some specific grantsmanship technique, tricks. I would say that if you're unable to demo something that, for example, that you thought you might normally be able to demo, you should just, justify that, right? That you would have wanted to, but were unable to, right? So that the reviewers know that you didn't just not do it.
It's a complicated device. You've got to show need. You've got to show that your science is going to be improved by the device. It's important to try and do your best to get preliminary data if you think it's going to be important. You should know as the applicant if your requests would be better served with having preliminary data present or not. And you should make every attempt to do that if you can.
I mean, I try not to presuppose how reviewers are going to respond to things or interpret things, but I would have to say that if you were making a usage case, for example, a duplicative system request, and you said, our numbers were down this year because our campus was shut for 3 months because of COVID, it would be churlish of a referee to ding you for that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just as long as you can explain the special circumstance and have it on record in your proposal, that the reviewers, were facility managers or faculty members as well, so we're experiencing.
So Lisa Cameron put something into the chat that I think we should comment on, which is that you can, in the question of preliminary data, and of course Simon very adeptly handled the can of worms. The concept of preliminary data can be, depending on the application, the study section, et cetera. But you can send, if you really want preliminary data and you can't have a demo, you can contact the companies and see if you can send samples to them or some other way of visiting them or some, I mean, I've done that. I've done all of those things. So now sometimes you're not going to get back the data that you expect because maybe they don't know as much as you do about the samples. It depends on the kind of instrument. But if I think the point was, I don't want to speak for Lisa, but I think the point was, be careful, because if you just say, oh, we couldn't have an on-site demo, so there's no preliminary data, too bad, so sad, somebody could theoretically say, but I sent samples to such and such a vendor and you could have done that too. So be careful.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So we can go back to the starting questions here. Number 3, how much consideration should be given to including research projects with grant end dates that are really close to the S10 funding date? So again, we had quite a discussion about this in our panel. And certainly it's only required that the research projects, the end dates are sort of after the submission of your grant. Because during the year or so that your grant is being reviewed, et cetera, some of these PIs may have reapplied for their grant, right? Or they have pending applications that might be funded, only later. So there isn't a strict requirement. And in fact, I believe in study section, many of the people that run the study sections discourage the study section members from making particular comments about the grant end date being too close to the funding date for the instrument. You can just follow very specifically the guidelines on the S10 RFA for that point. Okay, so there are a couple questions about the benefit of including non-NIH work, right, in your request for an instrument. so the major users obviously are required to have NIH support, but many grants actually do include minor users that aren't funded by NIH grants. Josh, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think the program announcement has the criteria pretty clearly, the minimum number of users with NIH funding and the percentages of the minimum percentage of NIH funded work that's included in the AUT. I think it's 75%. Don't quote me on that. I think an important concept though is, if you say we've got 80% of the AUT will be covered by funded NIH funded users, the other 20%, think about how you're going to pitch that. Are you just going to say we have these other people with great projects, they don't have NIH funding, or are you going to say we're going to set, some of that is going to be for preliminary studies or new faculty, things like that. But the important thing is for people that might be coming from like a NSF type approach, the broader impacts consideration really doesn't come into play here. So, keep in mind, it's still going to be primarily NIH type biomedical research applications, even in that non-NIH funded category for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, I think we addressed section 4. Simon did that quite well in his slides. So I'll go back to some of the audience slides. Some of the audience questions. Actually, this is a good question that appears both on the specific queued questions and in the audience. So how do you convincingly demonstrate adequate institutional support? And in particular, there's a question that asks whether institute matching, if they match some or half of the funds, does that help? Does it say, for example, by providing institutional match, this instrument is really important to us, or does it say, do we have the funds but want fancier hardware? So that's a really good question. Simon, do you want to address that?
So I want to reiterate the fact that institutional support is absolutely obligate for maintenance, support, and so on and so forth. They can also say we are going to help fund these staff salaries. They can certainly help support the instrument, and it may influence the study section, but it's not a prerequisite. It's not part of the request unless you're asking for something that's more expensive than the mechanism allows. The classic, well not classic, but a case in point that comes up nowadays quite frequently is the insatiable need for Krios microscopes. These are these big cryo-EMs, and they cost $6-7 billion, which is way, way beyond the upper limit. In our institution, we got, not myself, but the guy that who leads the cryo-EM component of the institution was offered conditional support in that if he got the money from the government, the institution would provide the rest. And that was written in a grant, and letters were provided, and he got the grant, and the institution helped pay for it. That's a situation where you have to have institutional support because the thing is so expensive. Personally, I don't expect my institution to support the devices beyond service contracts, and the guarantee that if I can't manage to get the funds to support the device, that they have to give me more support. This is different from some of the other mechanisms from the NSF, for example, where the institution is expected to contribute to the running of the device. It's a complicated thing, but I do want to reiterate, the institution is on the hook and needs to very clearly state that they will support service contracts, maintenance, and et cetera, unless there's a shortfall. But they do not, and it's not a scorable criteria that they have to give you more support beyond that.
Right, so there is a scorable criteria for institutional support, and in my study sections, I actually have seen it definitely be reflected quite positively if there are staff salaries provided in part by the institution.
So that's not part of the PAR. The PAR is specific about institutional support to support the service of the instrument. It doesn't state that you need to have institutional support to pay for salaries or any other part of it?
Right. No, it's not required, but it definitely, in terms of a department helping to fund a core by to support an instrument by providing part of a salary or providing part of the purchase cost of the instrument. That in the study sections that I've participated in is generally received favorably.
Received, but it's not a requirement.
Right. No, it's not a requirement, but it can definitely help influence a score positively. Okay, great. Going back to some audience questions.
So this is sort of a little transverse, but I want to link this question of having institutional support, right, pay for a piece of the instrument, which Simon covered very well. With also just, there have been a bunch of questions about linking together instruments versus a single instrument versus upgrade. I mean, Simon talked about, piece of an instrument with the institution covering the rest. So I think maybe we should talk about that for a second, because I do want to say that, it is specifically written in the program announcement that an S10 can be used for an upgrade. And that upgrade could mean, for example, to speak Simon's language, a laser, a super top of the line laser bed can cost, $200,000 or, even more if we're talking about, a tunable IR for, you could just have a component could be purchased through an S10 to upgrade an existing microscope, for example, or existing instrument. So, but again, as Caroline said, talk to the program director, scientific review people at the NIH about this if you have any questions. But you can be sort of flexible, depending, as long as you fulfill the criteria.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to another question. I'll refer this to Sherry. This person asked, I run a core with a fee-for-service system. If I get an S10 with a group of PIs, can I or should I charge them for analysis, use of the instrument, or in order to pay for the salaries and contracts?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Because the S10 will cover operating expenses. So yes, you're free to charge the operating expenses.
Yes, you have to include that in your plan, your business plan.
Exactly. Right. And then,
well, I think we should be careful though, because I think the word analysis can mean different things to different people. So microscopists, when they say analysis, they're thinking post-acquisition, data analysis. And, you could talk about the overall financial model of the facility. But you have to be careful, because the S10 budget really is about the operation and management of that instrument. So if you're charging for image analysis from images acquired from that instrument, that is slightly different. And I think, we just should make that distinction. But if by analysis, the person who wrote the question meant, analyzing samples, meaning sticking samples into the machine or whatever, then that obviously you can have assisted utilization, you can charge for trainings, you can charge for, helping, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it seemed like from that question that, it's more of, do the major and minor users get charged? And yes, they do. Yeah. If they're, and like you said, Josh.
Yeah. And that speaks to the compliance piece, which Simon mentioned, which is really important, that you make sure that you are following uniform guidance, and if you're not sure what that means, that you talk to the appropriate institutional officials to confirm that. And your pre-award people should be able to help you. Your business management people should be able to help you. But there are clear red flags in terms of recharge, cost recovery. And make sure that you're writing what you're writing is compliant.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So here's
what Josh is saying is, do not include the word discount. Right. You can supplement, but you can't.
Or subscription.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. So here's a good question from the audience. What is a reasonable % AUT to allow for future growth? And should that be considered at all? That's actually a tricky point. Simon, do you want to take that?
I like the way you give me all the interesting story. So I think here's an example from my own personal life that speaks very closely to this, is that I think we have always got new projects coming on board. We always have new investigators coming on board. And obviously, while the majority of the use of the device should be for current NIH funded users, divided into heavy and major and minor users, there's always people who are doing, particularly young investigators who need access to this particular device who don't have obvious funding support. And I think including a couple of minor users that have really good science, because don't forget, if you're going to include them, you should show why you want to include them. If they have really good science and can really demonstrate an absolute need, it's very compelling, because they are the future of science. Not people like me who've been doing it for years, but the people with the new ideas. So I think it's always good to include a couple of minor users who are either underfunded or still building their funding program. It shows dynamic, it shows exciting, it makes it the proposal less pedestrian. So yes, I would encourage you to show, but the point here is that don't just put people in for the sake of putting them in to make it look like you have more users. Put them in because they really add to the quality of the application and the definite showing of need for the device that you're requesting funding to support.
Yep. And remember, it doesn't have to be 100% fully booked, right? In terms of the listed users, so that there is room for future potential growth. Also, as existing users projects cycle through. So yeah, it's definitely good to mention a future plan for the instrument too. Okay, just here's another question in the chat that sort of talks about or asks whether there's an absolute requirement for an institution to cover the full cost of the instrument maintenance agreement. You know, you know, citing language from the RFA, right? So we just want to be clear. No, the institution from day one does not need to cover maintenance of the instrument. That is expected to be recovered, you know, through the shared, you know, the facility or other grants, you know, possibly with a contribution from the institution. What the institution must say is that it will backstop maintenance costs and service costs, right? And staffing costs as well. So the instrument can be made available for the full 5 years or expected lifetime if for some reason user fees fall short, right? Or other grant sources are unable to pay for operating costs. So the institution is required to backstop it, not provide it all from day one. Just wanted to clarify that. Yep, thanks for that question.
But I also think there's a sort of semi-alternative reading of that question, and maybe this is not the intent, but I want to just state this explicitly, that you could also say, you know, does every instrument need to have a service contract? And I think the answer is no. So if you hire an optical physicist who builds microscopes you know, as a profession, then you don't necessarily need to have a service contract as long as you have all of the parts accessible. And in that case, you would want the university's institutional letter to backstop that person's salary and the funds required for parts, for example. So I think the point is, and someone else also asked a question, sorry to cross streams, but somebody else also asked a question about third-party service suppliers, right? Whether it needs to be a bona fide service contract from the instrument vendor. And I think the point again is, it's just, you know, you have to ensure that the university has to backstop 5 years of operation, no matter what happens in terms of revenue, utilization, or, you know, anything. However you can justify that, however you can make a cogent case for that.
Yeah, yeah, and you can have a plan for whatever makes sense, third party or vendor support of the instrument for its maintenance. Yeah. Okay, so Sherry, looking at the technical expertise of a core director, if the core director has good general expertise but might be lacking in use of a particular brand new instrument, is there a recommendation to augment this technical expertise, or how would you sort of write about that in a grant proposal?
Yes, I would reach out to others that can help support you. Again, we put in for a spectral instrument, and we had backing of other people who have used those kind of instruments. So, you know, we can reach out. We've also done that for some instruments that we were just putting into the core. So those would be my recommendations.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, and I've definitely seen in grant applications, right, for brand new types of technology, you have to emphasize the experience of, for example, the PI or some of the major users or core staff in related technologies, right, that they have the background, right, that they could quickly learn, and then mention maybe explicitly vendor tutorials, right, or vendor technical support, or attending a training session, right, outside of your campus. So have a clear plan to train the staff, and then to train new users as well. So reviewers are understanding when it's a brand new technology that no one on your campus has experience with, as long as you have a strong plan for acquiring that experience. Yes. Okay.
There are a bunch of questions about AUT coming in.
Yeah. Do you want to read a couple of them, Josh?
Sure. Yeah. So one says, should you aim for a certain amount of AUT? How do you calculate for instruments going to be autonomously used? Is Monday to Friday 8 to 5 accepted? And I mean, I think I'll just lead in. Obviously, let's hear from everyone else. But, I think, again, it depends on the instrument. It depends on the user base, and it depends on the operational the way that the facility operates. So, if it's in a building that's locked out of hours, that changes. If the system needs 5 hours of expert calibration before it can be put a sample on it, then that affects it. So it depends a lot on those extrinsic factors. There is no magical formula for AUT. It's as long as you can make a justifiable rationale that an expert would be able to recognize as holding water. That's my broad general response.
I could get a little bit more specific on that, Josh, if that's okay. So it depends on how much the machine needs help and care as well. There's two extra facets to this. So we have a bunch of multiphotons, and we allow people after hours to book all sorts of time, but they have to meet a certain experience classifier. And in the proposals, I define what that is expected to be. Not something woolly, it's more, they have done 100 hours of use of this device, they have done this, they have done that. In other words, you say these people can use it after hours, which expands the AUT, because I think all these microscopes should be used 24/7 if you can, or any device. But you need to tell them what that classifier is. And there's another group of instruments, for example, cryo-EMs or slide scanners, which can run very autonomously 24 hours a day. They just need to be fed. So there's stuff going through them. So you can go we had a demo of a slide scanner a few months back, and it ran full-time 24/7 for the entire period of the demonstration. And that was really refreshing because it reduces the usage costs, but also it means you have a much higher AUT. So I think really I'm saying the same thing as Josh. You need to define what your AUT is and make sure that if you have exceptions to the AUT in terms of letting other people use outside work days, tell the people who are reviewing the grant what those characteristics of those particular users has to be, what level of experience they have to have, or education, etc.
I would.
Yeah, and I can say too, as a panel member, we don't expect instruments to be used over weekends, right, or overnight, if they require users to be there, right. Certainly, if you can set up an instrument and have it run for 2 days, you should demonstrate that it'll be available. But we're not expecting people, right, to work on Saturdays and Sundays in order to have a big AUT. So yeah, so many AUT calculations involve only sort of 10 hours a day on weekdays, and maybe the occasional weekend. That's very typical. And keep also in mind the practical point that it has to relate to the percentage of time of the major users, right? So you can't say, have a 24/7 sort of AUT and then the users report that they're only going to be using it, Monday through Friday, because then you're going to have a really big mismatch between your the percentage of time that you think it's available and the percentage of time that your users are actually reasonably going to be able to use it. So it's yes.
So I would also add, one thing that can help, and I agree with Simon very much, you really need to define what your AUT is in a very concise manner. But also our oversight committee has helped to develop that. And if you could say, our advisory committee says, you know, we're doing 45 hours Monday through Friday, the rest, the other 5 hours, you know, out of a 10-hour day is maintenance, then that has worked well for us. So that's just another way to approach it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think it's about the time that we're supposed to wind up now, Josh. Thank you very much to the audience for your great questions, and thanks so much to the panel, Simon, for you know, inspiring us with his initial slide deck, and for all of you for working together to answer these questions. I learned a lot.
Yes, so I just have a few ending messages. So yeah, thanks to Sherry and Simon, and of course Caroline, and thanks to Elena again from the NIH for really helping put this together in the background. Thanks to Promega. I should say there was a message from Promega in the chat about this question of demos, and they said that they can do live virtual demos of instruments so that they can actually receive your samples, and they can have you on you know, chat and video conference, and they can, you know, you can get live real-time feedback. And I think that's really an important point, and I'm sure a lot of vendors can do that. Similarly, the question of remote demos, Allison North put in, you know, you can also look to your colleagues at other institutions who might run cores that have the instrument that you want to get, you know, maybe across the world or whatever, that you could send samples to get some demo. It doesn't have to be necessarily a demo provided by the vendor. It could be a demo provided by another expert user somewhere else. So finally, I just want to remind everyone that in the exhibit hall, from basically now until 3 p.m., there will be sponsor reps. So please go and interact with them in the sponsor hall. There'll also be a bunch of 10-minute presentations by the sponsors in the Innovation Theater. At 1:30, the DEI Town Hall is starting. So please go to that and bring your questions and thoughts and ideas for how to enhance, you know, DEI in core facilities and ABRF in general. And finally, at 3 p.m., we have the keynote speaker, David Reich, and also the breakouts in the afternoon following that. And then the day will end with the technology showcase, and the networking event will be the last thing. So
can I say something, Josh?
Go for it.
If any of you get stuck with really sticky questions, I've been writing these grants for a very long time, and I don't know whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, but you can find my email address and send me questions directly. I don't mind doing that. I think it's so much better as a reviewer to read a good proposal than something that isn't good. And so I'll happily put myself up as the volunteer to take offline questions after the fact. The slide deck, I believe, is freely available. If it's not, if you send me a mail, I'll happily send that off to you as well. There's nothing confidential in it.
I'd second that. Yeah, send all your questions to Simon. No, seriously, I think we're all happy to receive them. But also, I'm going to make a pitch to the ABRF mentorship, the new ABRF updated mentorship program. And this kind of thing could be really a perfect use case for the ABRF mentorship program. So, you know, if you're looking for help with an S10, obviously more broad general stuff, but grants personship and you know, try to find a mentor with S10 experience and go through the ABRF mentorship program.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a great suggestion. Yeah, and the video and the slides for the
program staff as well. I mean, Margazata's team are great at answering questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the slides for the presentation and the recording will be available through the ABRF website after the meeting. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.